Wilson was in command of the bridge of the Star of the Sea cruise ship, a luxurious vessel with more than 2,000 passengers on board. The Atlantic crossing had been uneventful until then. The sky was clear, the sun was setting on the horizon, and everything seemed calm. But suddenly, a signal on the radar interrupted the peace. A small, blinking dot appeared on the screen, moving slowly towards the large ship. "Captain, we've got something on the radar," called out Mike, the navigation officer, frowning. "It looks like a small boat adrift." Wilson approached the screen, narrowing his eyes. "Any identification?" "Negative. No communication, no radio response." Wilson thought for a moment. A ship adrift in the middle of the ocean wasn't that unusual, but the fact that there was no radio response bothered him. He looked at his crew, all waiting for his orders. "Let's investigate," he decided. "Prepare the rescue boat. Mike, you lead the group. Take John and Carter with you." Mike nodded and quickly headed for the deck, where John, an experienced sailor, and Carter, a young, restless engineer, were already waiting. The dinghy was lowered into the water, and they set off towards the point on the radar, the smaller ship that seemed to be standing still, gently swaying in the waves. As they got closer, the view of the boat became clearer. It was a weathered wooden vessel, with peeling paint and a sense of abandonment emanating from every inch of its structure. The name, Maria Jane, was faded on the bow. The silence was absolute. There was no sign of movement, no voices, not even birds flying overhead. It was as if the sea itself had become a dead place. John climbed up first, flashlight in hand, and the other two followed him. The smell of mold and salt permeated the air. They called out, but no answer came. Carter began to search the cabin, finding only empty nets and nautical instruments corroded by time. "It looks like it's been abandoned for weeks," Carter muttered. Suddenly, a low sound came from inside the ship, a drawn-out moan, like someone struggling to breathe. They looked at each other, alarmed. "This way," whispered Mike, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. When they opened it, they were greeted by a disturbing scene. A thin man with disheveled hair and an overgrown beard sitting against the wall. He was dirty, his clothes were rags, and his eyes were fixed on a distant point with an expression of absolute dread. His lips moved repeatedly, uttering an almost inaudible whisper. "The last passenger, the last passenger." Mike approached cautiously. "Sir, what happened here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But the man didn't seem to hear. His gaze passed over Mike as if he were invisible. His lips kept moving, repeating the same phrase like an endless litany. "The last passenger. The last passenger." John put his hand on Mike's shoulder. "We've got to get him out of here. He's in shock. We need to get him back to the Starfish." Mike agreed. "All right. Let's move him carefully." They lifted him with difficulty. The man kept mumbling, his head hanging to one side, his eyes still fixed on an invisible void. When they finally got him into the dinghy, a strange sensation hung in the air. It was as if the smaller ship itself breathed a sigh of relief. A sudden chill ran down Wilson's spine as he saw the group return. Back on the Starfish, the man was taken straight to the infirmary. Wilson watched from afar, puzzled. Something was terribly wrong. Whatever had happened on that drifting ship, he knew they were only just beginning to find out. As the man was taken inside, his murmur became a whisper almost audible to everyone on deck. "The last passenger. The last passenger." And suddenly the ship's lights flickered, as if a shadow had crossed the electrical circuit. Wilson felt a shiver run through his skin. And at that moment, he knew that something, or someone, unwanted, had just boarded the Star of the Sea. Nurse Sarah was finishing preparing the bed in the infirmary when she saw the group coming in, carrying the man rescued from the drifting ship. He looked more fragile in the intense white light, his pale skin contrasting with the deep circles under his wide-open eyes. He struggled slightly, still muttering the same phrase in a low, hoarse tone. "The last passenger. The last passenger." Wilson, observing the scene from the entrance, approached, crossing his arms as he tried to assess the man's condition. "How is he?" Wilson asked Sarah, keeping his voice low. "In shock," she replied, without taking her eyes off the patient. "He's not answering questions, and his pulse is racing. We'll need a little time to try and stabilize him." Wilson nodded, but felt a growing unease in his chest. The man didn't just look shocked. There was something in his eyes, something that looked haunted. He turned to Mike, who was standing off to the side, still trying to process what he had witnessed on board the Maria Jane. "Any idea what might have happened on that ship?" Wilson asked. Mike shook his head thoughtfully. There were no clear signs of a struggle, but the place was abandoned, as if everyone had simply disappeared. And this guy, it's like he's seen a ghost. Wilson didn't like that last word. There was something disconcerting about the situation, a feeling that they were messing with something they didn't understand. He decided he needed answers. "Keep trying to talk to him, Sarah. See if you can get any information. We need to find out what happened there." Sarah nodded and tried to approach the man calmly. She bent down beside him, speaking softly. "Can you hear me?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now. You're in the Star of the Sea. Can you tell us your name?" The man's eyes seemed to focus on Sarah for a brief second, but then they were lost in the void again. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear something from his mind. "Don't let him in," he murmured, his voice a little louder. "Don't let him in." "Let who in?" Sarah insisted, leaning closer. "Who's he?" The man began to tremble, his fingers curling around the bedsheets. His eyes widened even more, and he began to whisper frantically, as if trying to conjure up some invisible protection. "The last passenger. The last passenger." Sarah pulled away a little, trying to stay calm. "I think we're dealing with a deep psychological trauma, Captain," she said to Wilson, who was watching the scene with growing concern. "It may take some time before he feels safe enough to talk." Before Wilson could respond, the lights in the infirmary suddenly flickered on. Sarah looked up in surprise as the room was briefly plunged into darkness. A slight cold breeze blew through the room, a wind that shouldn't have been there. "What was that?" Mike asked, looking around as if hoping someone could explain the phenomenon. Wilson picked up his radio and called the control room. "This is the captain. We've had a power failure in the infirmary. Report the situation." After a few seconds of static, the answer came from the communications operator, Jack. "Nothing to report, Captain. Everything seems normal in the control room. Just a brief flicker in the systems, but everything is operating correctly now." Wilson frowned. The man on the bed began to babble faster, his voice becoming a desperate wail. "The last passenger! The last passenger! He's coming for us! He's coming for us!" Sarah, worried, tried to calm him down. "It's all right. You're safe here." But suddenly the man stopped talking. His breathing became slower, his eyes closed, and he fell into a deep sleep, as if a deep exhaustion had overwhelmed him. "Well, at least he's resting now," said Sarah, a little relieved. Wilson nodded, but the discomfort remained. "Let's keep a lookout here, and see if you can talk to him again when he wakes up. We need answers." As the ward returned to an eerie silence, Wilson turned to Mike and whispered, "Keep an eye out for anything else strange. Something's not right. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Mike agreed, and the two of them left the infirmary, but not before Wilson took one last look at the sleeping man. The unease in his chest wouldn't go away. The Starfish continued its journey, but now there was a new shadow on board, a presence he didn't know how to face. And from down the corridor, the soft, distant sound of something dragging on the walls echoed, almost imperceptibly, as if the ship itself were beginning to breathe differently. Night had fallen on the Star of the Sea, and the ship seemed shrouded in a veil of unusual silence. In the lounges and restaurants, the passengers were still trying to enjoy their trip, but a feeling of unease hung in the air. Anxious whispers spread through the corridors, fueled by rumors of what had happened to the man rescued from the drifting ship. Wilson walked along the deck, observing the faces of the passengers. Some seemed uneasy, turning frequently to look behind them, as if they sensed that something was following them. The captain felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't like how the atmosphere on board had changed since they had brought that man onto the ship. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps made him turn around. It was Mike, running towards him with a worried expression on his face. "Captain, something strange has just happened," said Mike, panting. "I was on the upper deck when I heard a noise, as if someone was dragging chains. When I got there was no one there, but I felt an intense chill, as if the air had suddenly become colder." Wilson narrowed his eyes, trying to understand. "Chains? On the upper deck?" "Yes, and that's not all. Some passengers reported hearing footsteps and whispers in the corridors, but when they checked, there was no one there. And the lights." Mike paused for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "The lights keep flashing in random parts of the ship. Something is interfering with the electrical systems, but the engineers can't find a fault." Wilson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility. "Have all the areas checked again? We can't risk the safety of the passengers." Mike nodded, but hesitated for a moment. "What about the man in the infirmary? Has he said anything yet?" Wilson shook his head. "Nothing useful. Just the same incessant muttering. The last passenger. I'm beginning to wonder if he brought something with him, something we shouldn't have allowed on board." Before they could continue their conversation, a high-pitched scream cut through the air. Wilson and Mike exchanged an alarmed glance and ran in the direction of the sound. The scream was coming from the corridor near the main staircase. When they arrived, they saw a woman, a middle-aged passenger, leaning against the wall, trembling, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Next to her, her little daughter was crying, holding on tightly to her mother's arm. "What happened?" Wilson asked, trying to sound calm. The woman, still trembling, pointed to the door of one of the cabins. I saw someone, a shadow, crossing the wall, and then I heard a whisper. Something about a passenger. Something coming for us." Wilson felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He looked at the cabin door indicated by the woman and hesitantly approached. With a firm hand, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, lit only by the pale light from the corridor. Inside, there was nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, he saw something reflected in the mirror on the wall, an indistinct dark figure with eyes that seemed to glow in the dimness. Wilson blinked, and the image disappeared, leaving only his own confused reflection. "Did you see it?" asked Mike behind him, his voice low. Wilson nodded slowly. "Yes, but it seemed impossible." Back in the corridor, the woman and her daughter were still terrified. Wilson tried to calm them down, assuring them that they would check everything, but he himself wasn't convinced that there was anything that could be explained. "We need more men patrolling the corridors," Wilson told Mike as they left the cabin, "and I want security cameras monitoring all the entrances. We can't leave anything to chance." Mike agreed, but his eyes were full of concern. "Captain, do you think this has something to do with that man we found? What he was saying?" Wilson hesitated. "I don't know, but we need answers. If something is going on here, we have to find out what it is, and fast." Later that night, as the ship rocked gently on the waves, the lights flashed again, more intensely this time. For a moment, the whole ship was plunged into total darkness. In the pitch black, the sound of light footsteps could be heard, followed by a muffled whisper. When the lights came back on, one of the crew, Andy, was standing in the corridor, paralyzed, staring at the empty space in front of him, his face pale as wax. "Andy, what's wrong?" asked a colleague, approaching. Andy slowly turned his head, his eyes empty with terror. I saw the last passenger." And then, before anyone could react, Andy fell to the ground, unconscious, while the distant whispering continued, as if the ship itself was beginning to speak, telling an ancient and terrible secret. Wilson felt a growing tension in his shoulders as he made his way back to the infirmary. Andy's fainting and the passengers' reports were beginning to erode his usual calm. The ship seemed colder, as if an invisible breeze was constantly blowing through the corridors. The lights continued to flicker, and the atmosphere seemed increasingly heavy, almost oppressive. On entering the infirmary, he found Sarah sitting next to the rescued man. He was still lying on the bed, but now his eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, with a distant expression. Sarah looked at Wilson and shrugged, exuding a mixture of frustration and tiredness. "He just woke up, but he hasn't said anything useful yet," she explained. "He's still mumbling, but he seems a bit more aware now." Wilson approached cautiously. The man mumbled again, but this time there was a strange clarity in his voice, as if he was speaking directly to someone who wasn't there. Wilson leaned in, trying to catch every word. "We need answers," said Wilson firmly. "Who is the last passenger? What happened on your ship?" The man stopped mumbling for a moment. His eyes finally focused on Wilson, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he had come back to reality. His voice came out weak, broken, but understandable. We were on a normal crossing," he began, as if it were difficult to remember. "It was a cargo ship, only a few people on board. And then he appeared, a man that nobody recognized." Wilson and Sarah looked at each other. "Who was that?" Wilson asked. "Who appeared?" The man closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, as if he were trying to push away a painful memory. "The passenger. The last one. He seemed normal at first, but no one knew how he had gotten on board. He wasn't in the records, he wasn't on the list. When we asked, he just smiled, and then people began to disappear." The air in the infirmary seemed to get thicker. Wilson felt a shiver run down his spine. "Disappear? How?" "One by one," whispered the man, his voice trembling with fear. "They just disappeared. There was no sign of a struggle, no screams. They just disappeared. And every time one disappeared, the passenger seemed stronger, more real, as if it was feeding off us, using us to continue its journey." Sarah grimaced, visibly uneasy. "And what happened to you?" The man swallowed, his eyes wide with terror. I was the only one left. I was hiding in the engine room when he found me. He looked at me with those eyes, and I knew that I would be next. But then, suddenly, he disappeared, and I was alone. For days, weeks, until you found me. I thought I was free, but..." He stopped, his face contorting in a mixture of fear and despair. "But hell never leave. He needs a ship, passengers, to carry on. He always finds a way to get on board." Wilson tried to process what he was hearing. None of it made sense, but the man's expression, his lost look, said that he believed every word that came out of his mouth. "Why does he need a ship?" Sarah asked, trying to extract more details. "Because he's the last one," the man muttered. "And he needs a crew. He needs passengers to go on his way. It feeds on fear, on souls. And now that I'm here, is going to come after you, all of you." Wilson felt his heart racing. "What can we do? How can we stop him?" The man laughed, a bitter, desperate laugh. "Stop it? You can't stop what isn't alive, what isn't human. Just make sure he doesn't get in. Don't let him in." Before Wilson could ask another question, the ward lights flickered on again, and the room was plunged into momentary darkness. An icy wind blew past them, making Sarah's hair stand up slightly. When the light came back on, the man was staring straight at Wilson, his eyes wide, as if he had just seen something terrible. "He's here," whispered the man, his voice barely above a whisper. "He got on the ship." A sense of panic began to wash over Wilson. They had to act fast. He looked at Sarah, who was pale. "Let's close all external entrances," ordered Wilson. "Crew on high alert. No one is to walk alone. We need to monitor every corner of this ship." But before he could leave to give his orders, the radio on his belt squawked with a loud static, and a voice cut through the noise, the voice of Jack, the communications operator. "Captain, we need you on the lower deck, now. There's something you need to see." Wilson felt his stomach sink. He looked back at the man on the bed, who was laughing softly, with an almost relieved expression on his face. "Good luck, Captain," murmured the man. "He's already here." Wilson swallowed, turned, and walked out of the infirmary towards the lower deck, not knowing what he was about to face, but certain that the last passenger had begun his hunt. Wilson quickly descended the stairs leading to the lower deck, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the metal walls of the Starfish. Jack's voice on the radio still resonated in his mind, charged with an urgency he had rarely heard. Something was terribly wrong, and the warning from the man in the infirmary now seemed an inevitable omen. When he reached the lower deck, Jack was waiting for him, his face pale and sweaty, his eyes wide with fear. "Captain, you better see this for yourself," said Jack, pointing to the cargo hold door, an area rarely accessed by passengers. Wilson followed Jack's gaze and noticed the steel door partially open. A thin layer of mist seemed to creep across the floor, coming out of the hold like an icy breath. He felt a deep shiver, but took a deep breath and pushed the door open. As he entered, the air was colder, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As they advanced, the two noticed a trail of water on the floor, as if someone had walked there with wet feet. The trail headed towards the stern of the ship. "Who else has been here?" Wilson asked, his voice low, trying to remain calm. "No one, Captain," replied Jack. "At least, no one we should have expected." The water trail seemed to thicken, and a faint smell of brine mixed with something metallic filled the air. Wilson felt his heart race as he moved forward, illuminating the path ahead with his hand flashlight. Then he saw it. He stopped suddenly, and Jack almost bumped into him. On the ground, at the end of the water trail, there was a pair of shoes, perfectly aligned, as if they had been left there deliberately, but there was no one around. Wilson slowly bent down and touched one of the shoes. They were wet, soaked with seawater, and there was still a slight warmth, as if someone had worn them moments before. Is this from one of the passengers?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. Wilson nodded slowly, recognizing the shoes. They belonged to a man called Richard, one of the passengers he had seen at dinner the night before. "We need to find Richard," said Wilson, getting up. "And quickly." They hurried back down the corridor. But before they left the basement, the light flickered violently again, plunging them into total darkness for a few seconds. During those brief moments of darkness, they both heard a strange sound, something between a whisper and a moan, coming from somewhere nearby. When the light returned, the corridor was empty, except for the thin layer of mist that continued to creep across the floor. Jack looked at Wilson, his face marked by a mixture of fear and confusion. "Captain, did you hear that?" Wilson nodded. "Yes, and I have a feeling we're running out of time." Returning to the main deck, They began to ask the crew and passengers if anyone had seen Richard. The answers were all the same. No one had seen him since that morning. Disquiet began to spread throughout the ship, with people starting to gather in small circles, exchanging nervous glances. Sarah found Wilson in the corridor near reception. Her face was tense with worry. "Captain, there's more. We've received reports of 3 other passengers who have gone missing. Their cabins are empty, and no one has seen them since the afternoon." Wilson felt a chill. "Who?" Sarah looked at the clipboard in her hands. "Lisa Thompson, Greg Rogers, and a child. Emily Parker." Wilson closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the information. The feeling that something was watching them was growing by the minute. "Organize an immediate search," Wilson ordered. "I want all areas of the ship searched. No place should be overlooked." As Sarah walked away to relay her orders, Wilson turned to Jack and Mike, who had just arrived. "This is no longer a simple case of disappearances. Something is here with us. We need to find out what or who the last passenger is before everyone disappears." Mike nodded, but before he could reply, a red light flashed on the control panel next to him. It was the engine room alarm. Something was wrong. "That's the engine room, Captain!" Mike exclaimed. "Let's go," ordered Wilson, running towards the stairs. They descended quickly, the sound of their footsteps echoing along the empty corridors. When they reached the engine room, they found 2 engineers staring at one of the windows. They looked pale and paralyzed, as if they were stuck in a trance. "What happened?" Wilson asked, trying to catch his breath. One of the engineers, a man called Thomas, slowly pointed to the window. "Outside. Do you see it?" Wilson approached the window and looked out. In the dark, choppy sea, something seemed to be moving in the water, a shapeless shadow that shouldn't be there. He squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing, but the shadow seemed to be writhing, changing shape every second. "That's not possible," muttered Jack, standing next to Wilson. And then, suddenly, the shadow seemed to rise, emerging from the water, revealing an indistinct humanoid figure. It stayed there, floating for a moment, looking directly at the window as if it knew it was being watched. Then it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "He got in," muttered Thomas, the engineer. "The last passenger is here." Wilson felt the ground shake slightly under his feet, as if the ship were alive, reacting to what had just happened. "We need to find the missing now," shouted Wilson, turning to the others, "and figure out how to stop it before it's too late." As the team mobilized, the sound of light, almost imperceptible footsteps, seemed to spread through the corridors. A low, steady whisper echoed through the ship's speakers, as if the starfish itself was trying to speak. "They're here. The last passenger. He's already arrived." Wilson felt the panic settling in slowly, like a poison in his veins. The disappearances, the shadows, the whispers that now seemed to be coming from all directions. Everything indicated that the situation was becoming desperate. He knew he needed answers, and fast. The sight of the figure emerging from the water wouldn't leave his mind. He needed to understand who or what was the last passenger before he lost control of the situation. Returning to the command bridge, Wilson quickly pulled up all the recent navigation and communication records, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The fragmented reports and incessant mutterings of the man rescued from the drifting ship echoed in his mind. He needs a ship of passengers to continue. "Captain," Mike called out, entering the bridge. "The search team is still scouring the ship, but so far, nothing. No sign of the missing." Wilson nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the records in front of him. "Something's not right, Mike. This last passenger, he can't be human. We need to know how he got here and what he wants." He flipped through the pages of an old navigation log, looking for some detail that had gone unnoticed. Then something caught his eye, A note in the log of the Maria Jane, the drifting ship where they found the man. Confidential cargo transfer. Passengers' names, not disclosed. Secret passage to St. Mary's Psychiatric Asylum. Wilson frowned and continued reading. St. Mary's, he muttered. Mike moved closer, watching the captain's expression. What does that mean? The Mary Jane was transporting prisoners from a psychiatric asylum, Wilson replied, his tone serious. They had a secret transfer, and according to the records, one of the patients disappeared before boarding. They called him Passenger 13. Mike's eyes widened. Do you think it's him? What the man in the infirmary was talking about? The last passenger? Wilson nodded slowly. That makes sense. If this Passenger 13 disappeared, and then an unknown man appeared on the Mary Jane, and now he's here. He must have found a way onto our ship. But the question is, how? Before they could argue any further, the radio on his belt beeped again. This time, it was Sarah, her voice low and urgent. Captain, you need to come to the infirmary. The man, he's awake. And he's talking. More clearly this time. Wilson wasted no time. He and Mike ran down the corridors, dodging the crowded passengers, whose faces showed fear and confusion. The tension in the air was almost palpable. When they reached the infirmary, they found Sarah next to the man, who was now sitting up in bed. His eyes were clearer, but they still carried a deep terror. He wants all of you, said the man, his voice hoarse but stronger than before. Wilson approached slowly. Who's that? Who is he? Passenger 13? The man nodded, trembling. He was a patient in the asylum, a man with no past, no name. They said that he spoke to things that no one could see, that he could cross places, move from one world to another. But he could never leave. He could never escape. Until one day, he disappeared. And then, they began to disappear. First in the asylum, then in Maria Jane, and now, here. Wilson felt the weight of the words fall on him. How did he get in? He asked, more to himself than to the man. And what does he want? The man laughed, a shaky, disconnected laugh. He wants to keep going. He wants a ship, passengers, lives to sustain him on his way, to cross over to the other side. He needs bodies. He needs souls. Sarah looked at Wilson, the color draining from her face. Captain, is that some kind of entity? Something supernatural? Before Wilson could answer, the lights flickered on again, plunging the infirmary into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the man started shouting, pointing to a corner of the room. Over there! There! There he is! Wilson and Sarah turned around, but there was nothing, just the white wall of the ward. But the man's scream continued, frantic, as if he was seeing something horrible. He wants you. He wants the ship. He needs it to keep going. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. The man fell back on the bed, his eyes empty, his breathing irregular. He was unconscious again. Wilson felt a mixture of fear and urgency. He needed to understand more about this entity, about Passenger 13. Something in him knew that if he didn't act quickly, more lives would be at risk. We need to investigate St. Mary's Asylum, said Wilson, turning to Sarah and Mike. Maybe there's some information about this patient, about how to stop him. Sarah nodded, picking up a tablet to start her research. You'll see what I can find. Mike approached, lowering his voice. Captain, what if he's right? If the last passenger needs a ship to continue, what do we do? Wilson looked at the unconscious man on the bed, and then at Sarah and Mike. If he really is here, then we have to make sure he doesn't leave. We need to find a way to contain this entity, to keep it trapped if necessary. and fast. At that moment, Wilson's radio beeped again. A new message, this time in a cold, emotionless voice. "Captain, this is the upper deck. We've just found another pair of shoes near the entrance to the captain's cabin." Wilson felt his heart stop for a second. He looked at Mike and Sarah. "He's getting closer," he muttered. From the center of the ship, with his breathing quickening, he knew that the fight was just beginning, and time was against them. Every minute lost could mean one more disappearance, one more soul for the last passenger lost. Wilson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders as he ran towards his cabin. The warning from the team on the upper deck resounded in his mind. Another pair of shoes. Another imminent disappearance. The last passenger was approaching the center of the ship, and every second seemed to count. Sarah and Mike followed closely behind, their expressions marked by tension and growing fear. When they reached the captain's cabin, they saw the shoes, a small, worn leather pair typically worn by children, the same ones that Emily Parker, the missing child, had worn. "Damn," muttered Wilson, clenching his fist. He turned to Sarah. "Any information on St. Mary's Asylum?" Sarah consulted the tablet in her hands, scrolling quickly through the digital pages. "Yes, I found something. Passenger 13 was registered as John Doe, a fictitious name for someone with no identity. The report says that he had unexplained psychic abilities, was able to manipulate the perception of people around him, making them see things that weren't there. The asylum itself considered him dangerous, a kind of entity in human form." Wilson assimilated the information quickly. "What about the secret transfer?" "They tried to transfer him to another, safer location, but he disappeared before they boarded. The doctors thought he was dead, but then the disappearances on the Maria Jane started." Mike interrupted, his voice laden with tension. "Captain, if he's an entity capable of manipulating reality, how can we arrest him?" Wilson thought for a moment, looking at the shoes on his cabin door. He felt that the last passenger was close, so close that he could almost feel his gaze. "We need to lure him to a place where we can isolate him. If he needs a ship to continue his journey, then we have to convince him to stay stuck here." Sarah hesitated. "And how do we do that?" "First, we need to make sure that all the passengers and crew are safe," Wilson replied, determined. "Well, gather everyone in the main lounge, the most central and secure area of the ship. I want all the entrances locked and only one access point, and well isolate the spot where the shoes were found, and lure this thing there." Mike nodded, although he seemed skeptical. "And how are we going to lure it?" Wilson thought for a moment, and then an idea began to form in his mind. "I'm the captain of this ship. If he needs someone to command his passage to the next destination, perhaps hell see me as the ideal target. I'm going to challenge him. I'm going to call him to me." Sarah looked at him with concern. "That's too risky, Wilson. What if he decides he wants to take you and someone else with him?" Wilson smiled darkly. "He can only have one captain, right? Let's find out." With a plan in mind, they quickly began mobilizing the crew to gather everyone in the main lounge. The passengers, now visibly shaken and suspicious, were escorted to safety. Meanwhile, Wilson positioned himself near his cabin, the place where Emily's shoes were found, feeling an invisible presence approaching. He picked up the radio and pressed the button. "If you want a ship, come and get it. I'm the captain here. If you want to go on, you'll have to go through me." For a few seconds, nothing happened. A deep silence enveloped the corridor, and then the lights flickered again, plunging everything into darkness. When they came back on, Wilson heard a low sound, a dragging whisper, as if something was sliding across the floor. He looked down the corridor and saw the figure, A tall, thin man with an expressionless face, empty eyes, wearing clothes that looked as if they had been soaked in seawater. He was the last passenger. His face was an indistinct blur, but his eyes were fixed directly on Wilson. "You can't stop me, Captain," muttered the figure, his voice like the echo of distant thunder. "I need to keep going. I need a ship and a crew." Wilson felt the air grow thicker, colder. He lifted his chin, steadying himself. "This isn't your ship, and neither are these passengers. If you want to continue, you'll have to leave here alone." The figure took a step forward, and each movement seemed to make the ship tremble. "They're already mine. Don't you understand? They've belonged to me from the moment I set foot on this ship. I'm the final passenger, the last of them all." Wilson narrowed his eyes. "Maybe you are, but you don't have to take anyone else with you." He took a deep breath and, in an act of sheer determination, advanced towards the figure. "If you need a captain, then I'll take it, but only me, no one else." For a moment, the figure seemed to hesitate. The atmosphere around them seemed to distort, as if the air were twisting and contorting under some invisible pressure. Wilson felt a sharp pain in his temples, a pain that seemed to want to tear his mind in two. But he didn't flinch. The figure tilted its head, studying Wilson. "Do you offer yourself as my captain?" Wilson nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, leave all the others, and take me." Absolute silence fell over the corridor. The figure seemed to expand and contract, as if contemplating the proposal. Finally, she smiled, an empty, disturbing smile. "So be it." The lights flickered again, and this time, everything went out completely. In the pitch black, Wilson heard a sound like the flapping of a huge bird's wings. He felt a rush of air pass through him, and for a second he had the strange sensation of floating. When the lights came back on, Wilson was alone in the corridor. The figure had disappeared, and the air seemed lighter, as if an invisible pressure had been released. Sarah and Mike came running in, their eyes wide with terror. "Wilson, what's happened?" shouted Sarah. Wilson took a deep breath, trying to stabilize himself. I think he's gone. At least for now." Mike looked around, uncertain. "What about the missing?" Before Wilson could answer, a loud static cut through the radio, followed by several voices, confused and shaky. It was Jack from the control room. "Captain, the missing. They're coming back. They're appearing in the corridors, disoriented, but alive." Wilson felt a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion. "Keep them safe. Make sure everyone is okay." Sarah looked at him, still suspicious. "But what about you, Wilson? What happened down there?" Wilson wasn't sure how to answer. He looked at the spot where he had last seen the last passenger and felt a chill. "I think, for now, we're safe, but I don't know for how long."